you very much for listening to me in English once again. Last time I talked about something fairly specific, which was the image that Napoleon tried to project and to a large extent has succeeded in projecting on future generations, in which he toyed with his audience, he exaggerated perhaps his achievement, he played down those parts which were less significant. And what I'd like to do today is to try and put that in some sort of context by attempting, in a very general way, broad brush manner, to look at Napoleon's career and his achievements and to try and assess what he did that was of permanent value as far as France and Europe were concerned. Now, it seems to me the obvious way to divide it is between the two spheres of activity which he himself privileged: foreign policy, which meant essentially war as far as Napoleon was concerned, the creation of an empire abroad by arms, and secondly, the creation of an empire by other means, both in France and in the countries that he occupied and conquered, the creation of institutions, the creation of an imperial way of life, which some historians will say has certainly left a more permanent mark on Europe. After 1815, much of what he accomplished by military invasion was dissipated, but in many parts of Europe, northern Italy, Poland, even many of the ex-German states on the Rhineland, in many of these places, parts of his legacy remain permanent. So, a division into two parts, and I'll start with war, partly, I think, because that's how Napoleon is most remembered, and partly because I'm in Russia, and I'm quite sure that from a Russian perspective, it is Napoleon's invasion and his warlike aspirations that are most memorable. So, a little bit of background, first of all. The two lectures will be about the empire, by the way. The empire starts in 1804, but Napoleon's career clearly starts rather before that. A little bit of revolutionary background. Napoleon could not, it seems to me, have risen in the way he did as a soldier under the Ancien Regime. He came from the wrong class, and even if he could claim to be a nobleman of sorts, it was very much, in French eyes, of sorts. The Corsican nobility didn't count for that much in Paris, and for someone who was the son of essentially an urban sort of mercantile Corsican who had a noble pedigree, he said, it would have been inconceivable that you would have risen as high as he did in the ranks of the officer class. There are two things to say about that. One is that to become an officer, you had to, theoretically at least, have 4 grandparents, all of whom were nobles, and Napoleon didn't have that. He was essentially Corsican, and that means to some extent Southern Italian stock. He didn't fit in the French Ancien Regime model of nobility. He also, as his classmates rather unkindly noted when he got to military academy, spoke French with a horribly barbarous Corsican accent, which they laughed at. He was never fully received as one of them, because they, of course, were sons of nobles, in the main, who were going to make a career serving the king as officers in the Royal Army. He was at military academy in the 1780s. It was still the Ancien Regime. The revolution, well, may have been a dream in a few people's minds, but it certainly was no more than that. He chose the artillery as his arm, which I think is significant in a number of ways. Firstly, in order to be an artillery officer, you had to understand a bit about mathematics. I don't want to emphasize as it were, the nullity of some of the officers in the infantry, but I mean, they were essentially there because of who they were, of their pedigree, and of, to some extent, the social qualities which they had. They were seen as being people who could command men because of the kind of bearing they had. And if you look at the way in which officers are trained, still I think to some extent, in military academies, there is that social side to it. fencing is not really to develop military skills in war, although it does have some relevance. Dancing, going to balls, treating ladies with respect, all that kind of thing is about the social composition of the officer. You didn't have much of that in the artillery, and to be fair, if they had, I'm not sure that Napoleon would have passed as he was in the 1780s. It was much more about science, about mathematics, about getting gun angles right, things that you had to get right in the artillery, which had nothing to do with your presence on the battlefield. It was possible to do well in the artillery, even in the Ancien Regime, without being from the top drawer of nobility, although Napoleon did notice that when he did graduate from the École Militaire, he did come fairly far down the list and behind some nobles of proper pedigree. I think it's fair to say that until the Revolution, you wouldn't have picked Napoleon out as being a particularly likely prospect for the future. I mean, he'd done all right at school. His father had pulled a few political strings back in Ajaccio, and he had got into a French military school in Brienne, in France. He had then gone on to the École Militaire in Paris, and he came out with his full officer qualifications just 2 or 3 years before the Revolution. And then nothing very much happens. He gets posted to a rather dull provincial army barracks in Valence, in France. He gets rather bored. The Revolution comes along. He's looking for an opportunity. He's looking for promotion. And nothing very much comes until the siege of Toulon. In 1793, which is very much a political moment. I mean, Toulon was a naval port, is still a naval port on the Mediterranean. It's where the French Mediterranean fleet is based. The summer of 1793 was a very difficult period for the Revolution because not only was there a civil war in the Vendée in the west, but various provincial cities, which were otherwise Republican, rose in revolt against the Jacobins in Paris. The so-called Federalist Revolt. It affected Lyon, it affected Bordeaux, it affected Marseille in the summer of 1793. And then 2 months later, when all the others had been defeated, Toulon, the naval port, not only rose in revolt and declared itself to be a Federalist authority, i.e. it denied the legitimacy of the convention in Paris, not only did it do that, but it also handed over the fleet to the British and Spanish navies who were in the Mediterranean at the time. If you want something that can be described very easily as treasonable, what Toulon did was, I think, treasonable at the height of war. Anyway, the army was sent in with the aim of repressing the revolt in Toulon, in other words, besieging Toulon and bringing it to its heels. Conventional methods were not very successful. Napoleon offered a solution which, because of a bit of political maneuvering in the background, he was allowed to execute, and he becomes the hero of the hour for bringing Toulon to its knees, and incidentally starting off a terror in Toulon that would lead to several hundred executions in the port. But Toulon allowed him to catch the public eye as being a general who was brilliant, and it also allowed him to catch the political eye of his Jacobin, but this time his Jacobin masters in Paris. And that brings me really to the last question. Was he already, in some ways, a political figure? Was he interested in politics? Well, yes, we know that. In the 1780s, he had even been a kind of minor enlightened scribbler, if I can call it that, even when at the École Militaire. He wrote some pieces of fairly radical left-wing egalitarian sort of sub-Enlightenment writing. I mean, he's not a great Enlightenment thinker, but he is in the same tradition. He obviously models himself on some of the great writers of the day, Condorcet and others whom he had read. So he is committing himself publicly, at least, to being a man of the left in the 1780s. Some will say that by 1793 he is actually a Jacobin. As far as we know, he never joins a Jacobin club, but he does produce a little pamphlet, a little book, a play, which would indicate that his sympathies are with the egalitarians and with the Jacobins, and not with those who hide behind privilege. This is a work called Souper à Beaucaire, Supper at Beaucaire. It has 4 central characters, and it's quite clearly that the author is identifying with one of them, who is the radical Jacobin. But that's about as much as we know about his politics. What we do know is that his rise, and it is fairly meteoric, he's a general at 25, which is young, even for the French Revolution. It's not unique. Hoche was a general at 24. I mean, it's not only Napoleon who can achieve this. But if you're good, and if you catch the eye of the political authorities, you can get very rapid promotion. Clearly, he does have Jacobin friends in Marseille, in the south of France. They tend to have Corsican names, like Saint-Etienne, maybe a link with his Corsican background. But fundamentally, he is playing politics through his relatives, through his links with the Jacobin Club, and right through into the late 1790s, under the Directory, one of the directors, Barras, Paul Barras, is quite clearly a patron of Napoleon, who is encouraging him in his career. So he is using the political system, and arguably is being used by the political system through the 1790s. The rise you know about, and I'm not going to spend long on this. I think he made one key decision in 1793-94 when he was offered a command in the Army of the West. The army, in other words, that was sent to crush the Vendée. Napoleon, we know, thought about this and rejected it. But it's interesting that he was, as a military officer, able to reject a command that came from Paris. He preferred not to be involved in the Vendée. The Vendée was a dirty civil war. You weren't fighting soldiers, you were fighting peasants with shotguns and pitchforks. There wasn't much honour in it. And at the end of the day, well, either you won and you crushed the revolt, and that ran political risks too, or you lost, and it was deeply humiliating. As we know, the man who did take the command, General Turreau, gets into huge political hot water over the Vendée. I mean, he is ordered by Paris to crush the revolt. He is ordered to execute men, women, and if necessary, children in villages that had over to rebels. He does this, but he finds himself on trial before the convention in 1795, accused of war crimes. This was the kind of scene Napoleon didn't want to get involved in, and from a personal point of view, he was quite right. But what you find is that through 1793, after Toulon, he is waiting for what he sees as his rightful command, and it doesn't come. So he stays in the provinces, he gets bored, he even early in the revolution is playing about with Corsican politics. It's not an immediate and sustained rise that we're seeing, it's a slightly juddering rise of a young officer who's deeply ambitious, believes he's deeply able, and feels rather resentful that he is passed over. It is under the Directory, it's when the Directory takes over, and people like Barras are powerful, that Bonaparte gets his first break when he is given command of the Army of Italy in 1796. And from that point onwards, essentially, he will be in the public eye. We saw before his use of the press, his manipulation, if you like, of journalists in Paris, very important in creating a permanent image of his glory. And from Arcole to the moment Campoformio, for instance, when he imposes a treaty off his own back on the Austrians, Napoleon is a central figure, and he's even a central figure in the politics of Northern Italy at this time, as well as being a successful general. We know quite a bit about the Egyptian campaign, and I won't again stress too much here because it belongs in the period before the Empire. But again, the mastery of propaganda, the ability to turn a campaign that wasn't actually very successful, militarily, I mean, he lost his army, among other things, in what is today Syria. But nonetheless, the propaganda, the scientific discovery, taking linguists, taking archaeologists with him to explore the empire, the great empire of ancient Egypt, the degree to which he himself was already talking of himself as a successor to the great empire of ancient Egypt. These are things that are remarkable for someone who otherwise was a general leading a fairly average military adventure of the time. I think the lesson I would draw from this is that throughout this whole period, both in turning down a command in the Vendée, to accepting them and fighting in Italy and in Egypt, his eyes remain on Paris. Yes, he makes himself beloved of his soldiers. Yes, he campaigns through the press and the military press as well as with arms, but always he knows that the real decisions are made in Paris. He is dependent upon his patrons in Paris, and he is dependent increasingly on public opinion in Paris. Interestingly, the journalists he makes use of in Paris are former Jacobins, and people like Coup, who had risen in 1793 and 1794, and then had been discarded by the regime when Robespierre fell and the Jacobin period was over. So in a sense, these left of centre, these Jacobin contacts that he had made earlier in the revolution, he holds on to during the period of his rise to power. I shall say nothing more than a few words here, because obviously the consulate is much more about political institutions, and I want to come back to it in the second part. But the 18th of Brumaire, what brings Napoleon to power, is quite clearly a military coup. Whether it's a military coup that he initiated is another matter, because the negotiations between the politicians of the Directorate and a general in the army had been going on for some months before. There was very strong reason to believe that Bonaparte was not their first choice of general. But they wanted a general because they wanted military muscle on the streets of Paris in case their political coup went wrong. I think he was lucky here. He was lucky in a rather unfortunate way, because his great rival, Hoche, had been killed in battle, oddly enough, in the West, a mere 3 or 4 months before. So he was left more or less as the leading young general of his day. Anyway, the consulate is about entrenching political power. Despite the fact that the army is still occupied at the beginning of the consulate, Napoleon is more and more in Paris. He's more and more concerned with political institutions, as we shall see. And in 1801, the war temporarily comes to an end with the Peace of Amiens, which Napoleon will say later was his genuine attempt to bring Europe to peace. Other countries tended not to believe this, and tended to believe that he was looking for a short truce while he regrouped. Britain in particular was deeply suspicious, not least because almost as soon as the peace had been signed, Napoleon started organizing or reorganizing his army at a camp at Boulogne on the Channel coast, from which the target appeared obvious as far as the British government was concerned. And then, of course, by 1804, we have moved from consulate to empire, and our story, if you like, of Napoleon as an imperial war leader can begin. I think almost immediately you can say he is preparing for war. The Peace of Amiens was a truce as far as both sides were concerned. Prussia, Austria, and Britain all regarded it as such. They saw the emperor preparing for war. The timescale, more or less the same. By this period, 1804, he is proclaimed emperor, but at that time he is still visiting his army at the Camp de Boulogne. And in May, the day after he is proclaimed emperor, he starts to create this new institution, the marshals of the empire, promoting the best people, the most meritocratic soldiers to the top positions under him. Again, the recreation of a meritocratic military system. And interestingly, a few months later, he invents this thing which we still have in France today, the Légion d'honneur. The Légion d'honneur nowadays it can be given to civilians as well, but it's interesting that about 90% or more of the légionnaires under Napoleon were actually drawn from the military. So clearly, it is a military decoration, first and foremost, which is also given to leading supporters or those who give outstanding service to the state in other ways. But in all these senses, the very first actions of the empire suggest that its main priority is to get back to the war and to complete, if you like, the military campaigns which Napoleon has already subscribed to. And just a few, as it were, factual bits of information. By 1805, the peace is over. What he was assembling at Boulogne became the Grande Armée, and it was 1 million men strong at one stage. It was a huge army which terrified Europe. It obviously terrified Britain because they thought he was about to embark to cross the Channel. Incidentally, one sort of piece of background information here. Britain is not traditionally terribly interested in continental Europe. It doesn't actually want to expand into continental Europe, but it does want to stop potentially hostile powers from controlling the land at the mouth of the Scheldt in what is now Belgium, because the ports along that river estuary are deep water ports from which you can effectively think of invading Britain. The point I'm making is that Boulogne is not a deep water port of that sort, and although he had 1 million men in Boulogne, it would have been very, very difficult for him to have got them on board boats and crossed the Channel. So the British were alarmed, but they weren't perhaps quite as alarmed as they might have been had Napoleon controlled Belgium, Holland at that time, as he later went on to do. So, in a sense, the fact that Napoleon doesn't invade Britain, but instead attacks the empire, say the Austrian Empire, or the Roman Empire, is seen as being a little bit the same policy in disguise. The Austrian Netherlands included, of course, the mouth of the Scheldt. If you attacked the Austrian Empire, and if you defeated it, you would also benefit by controlling exactly the area that Britain feared that Napoleon would control. So, in 1805, the army marches out of Boulogne in what most people thought was an unexpected direction, southeast. It attacked the Austrians in the campaign that was to end with French success at Ulm. And from that moment until the end of the empire, Napoleon would be virtually constantly at war. To begin with, hugely successful. After the attack on Austria, he moves on, as we know, to Russia and to other countries. But this was a moment when he had decided to declare war, and he knew perfectly well that another coalition of allies would be created against him. My last point there is possibly uncharacteristic for Napoleon, that in a way, in September 1805, it was the Allies who chose the moment to strike. They knew about the army on the Channel coast. They were fearful and distrustful of Napoleon, and the Austrians were marching towards France when he attacked them. So it was the one moment, if you like, when you can't say he planned the whole campaign and that other people simply responded to it. Charming little picture. It is the ideal, I suppose, of emperors and kings throughout the ages, except that by this time it was ceasing to be the ideal. Back in the 17th century, kings and emperors had ridden their horses at the head of their armies. That was part of the role that was expected of them. You wouldn't really expect George III to ride a horse at the front of the British army, for instance, by this time. It would have been a rather unedifying sight. But for Napoleon, this was how he wanted to be remembered. This is how he asked to be painted, in a sense, as an emperor who was controlling, defending, and making sacrifices, military sacrifices for the good of his empire. Okay, these are the years, 1805, 1806, 1807, when his reputation as a great military leader is established. High points, Austerlitz, which becomes almost mythologized, the sun going down at Austerlitz behind the French army. Jena, which was possibly his greatest battle, if you were judging it in terms of a clinical plan and a clinical execution of that plan, and indeed a pretty clinical execution of Prussia as well at the end of it, since about a third of Prussian territory was taken away in the peace treaty that followed. This was a complete wipeout, if you like, of the Prussian army, which was particularly important, if you like, in European eyes, because ever since Frederick the Great, the Prussian army had been seen almost as a prototype of a highly successful, modern, well-disciplined force. In front of Napoleon's large conscript army at Jena, it had collapsed. Backland later, as you know. But these are the high points against Austria and Prussia. Tilsit, I suppose, is the most memorable diplomatic moment when I suppose the two people who had come out of the war so far, either unscathed or at least damaged, Alexander I being the other, met on the Niemen and signed a treaty in which they more or less divided zones of influence between them across Europe. Were they keeping the peace? Well, possibly, if both sides believed in what they were doing and trusted the other. It's fairly obvious from 1807 onwards that Alexander does not trust Napoleon. So, possibly not a permanent basis for a peace settlement in Europe. And the other thing, of course, that had happened was that Germany, Prussia, had been humiliated. In fact, Germany, to some extent, had been humiliated. Austria, after all, the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne, had been defeated, and the Holy Roman Emperor was no more, because Napoleon scrapped the title arbitrarily in 1806. So you first of all humiliate the Austrians, and you then humiliate the Prussians in battle. That is dangerous. Because one thing that it needs to, as always, when an army is totally outclassed, is immediate self-examination and military reform. And the Stein and Hardenberg reforms, which make the Prussian army into the force it will be throughout the 19th century, stem directly from the defeat of Jena and from Prussia asking herself, what can we do to stop this ever happening again? So I think the high points from Napoleon, 1805, 1806, 1807 possibly, thereafter, I'm not so sure. In 1808, he invaded Spain, as you know, and the Peninsular War begins, the so-called Spanish Ulcer, which will continue until 1814, essentially, when Wellington crosses the Pyrenees into France from the southwest. At the same time, of course, in 1814, the Austrians and Russians in their coalition are attacking France from the east, and the Campagne de France is being fought in eastern France. It's the first time, in other words, since the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars in 1793, the first time since 1793, indeed, that the war had been fought on French territory. Up to that time, it had been a war of expansion fought for other people's land. In 1793, the Spanish had invaded Perpignan, and had taken the city of Perpignan, but that was the last time when foreign troops had been on French soil. But from the beginning of the Peninsular War, the successes are more rare. Yes, against the Austrians in 1809, but there was one exception to that. 1810, not a lot happens, but by 1811, 1812, Napoleon is more and more committed to this continental system and enforcing the continental system, which he has worked out as his way of destroying Britain. In 1812, he then, as you know, takes the mildly surprising decision to invade Russia. And then by 1813, his empire is crumbling. People are seeing that he is losing. I mean, the Moscow campaign had a terrible effect psychologically on Napoleon because his allies could see that he was no longer the all-conquering warrior whom you had to support, otherwise you would be crushed. And so one by one, the German states that had been his allies slip off and join the coalition against him. Leipzig is a turning point in many ways, the Battle of the Nations, not because Germans come together out of a passionate sense of German nationalism. They don't. Armies of different monarchs come together because these monarchs decided that Napoleon was beatable in 1813. So he had fewer allies to call upon for his own army, and he faced a multinational army against him in a way he hadn't done in the previous 10 years of war. And as we know, Leipzig is a turning point for the war on continental Europe. The following year, he raised yet another conscript army. And each year after 1812, he was forced to go back to the country and other countries he occupied and conscript yet more young men. The Campagne de France was the last desperate throw of the dice. Oddly enough, compared to the 1812 campaign of Leipzig, you can see elements of Napoleon's military genius as a strategist coming through in the Campagne de France. He fought well, but by that time, France was exhausted, and as we all know, the outcome was his abdication for the first time and his exile in Elba. So, what were Napoleon's military qualities? The first thing we have to remember, I think, is that his army was not really like traditional armies, at least not at the beginning. When the French, in particular, look back at their history and look back at different periods of their history, they don't say an awful lot about the military qualities of the Revolutionary Army, despite the fact that the Revolutionary Army had won a lot of battles. It was big, it was full of conscripts, it was public-spirited, but it didn't have very much military training, and hence tactics had tended to degenerate a little bit into throwing a mass against the enemy and hoping that the enemy would run away or resolve, as they did on various occasions from Valmy onwards. Napoleon's tactics were much better than that. They were designed to exploit the mass armies at his disposal, in the full knowledge that they were not as well trained, they could not be as well trained as the professional armies that he sometimes was up against. He could win with numbers, and he almost always made sure that he had more men on a battlefield than the other side. He could win with speed. He could win with very, very careful, meticulous planning. And I think that's something he's perhaps not often given quite enough credit for. The degree to which, both on the battlefield and before, he was planning out maneuvers, not exactly with tin soldiers, but almost with tin soldiers, before he actually met the enemy in the flesh. The second thing to say is that this is not a military revolution of any sort. We're not talking about the introduction of new weaponry, we're not talking about an entirely new strategy that no one had thought of before. There are arguments about whether there was a military revolution in the 17th century, and many people think there was, and clearly by the First World War there has been to some extent a military revolution with the use of tanks and aircraft and things of that kind. There's nothing of this sort in the Revolutionary Wars. They are fought with traditional artillery, cavalry, and infantry. And in that sense, I think they are the continuation of 18th century warfare. There have been many wars in the 18th century between France, Austria, Prussia, and Britain, and this was both in the colonial sense and on the European scale a continuation of many of these wars. Napoleon believed in speed, he believed in supplies, and he was rather good at these. He also believed in the importance of staff work on the battlefield. And if there is something that the Napoleonic armies are now seen as being innovative in, it is actually in managing a battle, organising the logistics of a battle. Oddly enough, that is exactly the element that worked so well for him in 1806-1808 and fell down completely at Waterloo in 1815 when communications broke down and he had no idea where Grouchy was and so on. So in a sense, when he was in his prime, Napoleon, as a staff officer, was without equal. And I think the last point is how he integrated the three arms. Generals or commanders had a habit in the 18th century of considering them separately and manoeuvring them separately. Napoleon integrated them and made them mutually interdependent. This led also to an alliance on sort of informal warfare, of skirmishing on the battlefield. I've already shown you this before, but very quickly, the only point I would make is that at its peak, Napoleon's empire covered a very large part of Europe, but by the end of 1814, it had declined again, more or less, to where it began. If we take Europe on the eve of the French Revolution, obviously almost all these blocs are empires. The one that isn't is Germany, which is a rather strange mishmash of about 49 different states, many of them in the west and along the Rhine. The Rhine, of course, and sort of Rome, Italy, very much the backbone of Europe when seen by France. It was the backbone of Charlemagne's empire, and in Napoleon's strategic thinking, it was the backbone of the empire he was trying to create as well. But roughly speaking, at this time, France, the Habsburg Empire, rather larger than we know it today, Kingdom of Prussia. Before 1789, there was the Kingdom of Poland, and the Russian Empire, of course, beyond. By 1812, well, various things had happened. The Habsburg Empire had become quite clearly an Austrian empire. Poland had been divided up between Austria, Prussia, and Russia, but various things had happened since. The Prussians had lost their bit, of course, after Jena. The Austrians are still there, and Napoleon had created his Duchy of Warsaw, while the Russian Empire had crept to the west. France itself is much bigger in 1812 than it was before. It includes Belgium and Holland, it includes these ports at the mouth of the Scheldt that give Napoleon command of harbours for the North Sea and the Baltic, and it now includes Nice and Savoy and various bits of northern Italy, Piedmont and so on, are now departments of France. But also, the dark blue, when it says it's part of the French Empire, what it means is that it is not part of a kingdom or a vassal state. It is directly attached to the French Empire and will be divided up into departments in exactly the same way as France is divided into departments. So large chunks of western Italy are now French départements, and most eventually, perhaps, what is now Croatia and the Illyrian provinces down there. The Ottoman Empire seems to be a little bit smaller. The Kingdom of Spain has been invaded and Joseph put on the throne, but the Kingdom of Spain has never really taken over. It's never integrated into the French Empire in the way that other parts more successfully were. And otherwise, well, Britain and Russia are still there in 1812, which is one of the things, of course, that Napoleon wanted to put an end to. Its continental system was aimed at destroying British trade, and hence Britain's support, its ability to support its army and navy, and in 1812, as you know, he invaded Russia. By 1815, this is after the Congress of Vienna, France is more or less restored to its original borders of 1790. Parts of Italy, which France had taken over, have now been restored as independent states. The Austrian Empire, once again, holds sway over Lombardy and much of northern Italy. Prussia has resumed its interest in Poland and is now by far the most powerful northern German state, and many of the smaller ones have disappeared in the process. Poland has disappeared. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw was Napoleon's and Napoleon's alone, and a large chunk of it has been annexed by Alexander I. And you can see, I think, that, well, Spain and Portugal have emerged as they were, as colonial powers in Central and Latin America. Portugal, incidentally, for this period is being run by its king, who is in Brazil. So in a way, it's a fascinating example of an empire which has been reversed as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. And both Russia and Britain have emerged stronger. It doesn't show entirely here, but in colonial terms, Russia is about to have a period of expansion south and east, and Britain is about to have a period of colonial expansion in colonies overseas, and their territories in Europe are still intact. So, what can we say about Napoleon's qualities and his failings? I think as a strategist, there was a rather interesting exhibition at the Musée de l'Armée in Paris recently called Napoleon Stratège, which showed very clearly the ways in which Napoleon planned battles. And it's the meticulousness of it that is really striking. I mean, it's well known, it's famous that when he went on campaign, he tended very often to take a library with him. He read on campaign. But he also took books about strategy in the ancient world, in the Greek and Roman empires, and he would spend long hours into the night with his generals simply planning how the battle would go the following day or the following week. This, on the whole, bore fruit, at least it bore fruit when Napoleon was at the height of his powers in the 1790s and in the 1800s. He assesses the strengths and weaknesses of the other side. It's a detailed calculation of where on the battlefield he could make his advantage count. And there is a sense here not just of strategy, but of tactics and operational skills, a sense that on the battlefield he would leave nothing to chance. But there are weaknesses. This is a man who has made all his life in the land army, who knows about soldiers, and incidentally is well able to get on with them, to convince them that he is on their side, to make them respect and even love him. He's hopeless about naval tactics. He doesn't know much about ships, which does become actually a bit of a problem. The revolution had done a lot of good work, if you like, in revolutionizing the army. It had got rid of many of the old officers of the ancien regime, and many of them had, of course, simply emigrated and resigned their commissions, but it had replaced them with a new kind of army officer who was loyal to the regime and who was much more egalitarian in his disposition. The Navy had done nothing like this. La Royale remains a place where fairly conventional naval tactics reign, and where naval officers tend to be aristocrats, and that was true through much of the 1790s. At sea, I'm not saying the French were incompetent, they weren't. The French Navy in the 1780s had been largely rebuilt, but it was never going to compete with Britain, partly because Britain invested far more in the Navy than it did in the Army, and at crucial moments, the French Navy essentially disappeared from the war. Much of Britain's strategy consisted of keeping it in port. Both in Brest and in Toulon, for long periods, the French ships were simply in port and out of commission because they couldn't get out to sea. One reason why Toulon was so damaging the French fleet was in port and could therefore be handed over to the other side. It wasn't out at sea doing anything. And when it does get out to sea, both at Quiberon in 1795, at the Nile in 1801, and finally at Trafalgar in 1805, it gets destroyed. So essentially the naval contribution to the Napoleonic Wars was not wonderful. And this affected a lot of other things too. It affected communication between France and its colonies overseas, in the Americas, for instance. If the British Navy controlled the passages in the Atlantic, it could also control the trade routes to the colonies, which weakened the French even more. And after Saint-Domingue fell, as a result of a slave revolution, and became Haiti in 1804, after the Louisiana Purchase, when Napoleon handed over, or rather sold Louisiana to the United States, we began to wonder also about his commitment to overseas colonies. But it was dependent on naval power, and naval power was one thing Napoleon was never really able to establish. I think the French had better ships than they had in the 18th century, but there was only one moment in the 18th century when France actually controlled the seas, and that was at the end of the American War of Independence, when the last sea battle is a French victory over the British. So theoretically, at least in the 1780s, France controls the Atlantic approaches. What happened? Britain built 3 times as many ships as the French between 1782 and 1789 to make sure that that never happened again. And it is a matter of money, it's a matter of the commercial power of the City of London, it's a matter of tax revenues. Britain was able to do this when the French monarchy, as we know, in deep financial trouble in the 1780s, simply couldn't. And Napoleon couldn't reverse that trend. He had great generals. He had some splendid marshals. He didn't really have awfully good naval commanders in this period. Many of them are rather mediocre. Some of them squabbled among themselves. And effectively, after Trafalgar, what could they do? The main navy had been destroyed. The British controlled the seas, and once he tried to introduce the continental system, that also meant that the British were blockading the French coast. You're greatly weakened, even it seems to me, for land war, if you are unable to break that blockade at sea. So that's one source of weakness. I think colonial policy is a second. It seems to me that from the beginning he is fairly ambiguous. His main focus is quite clearly on the continent. He wants an empire, rather like Charlemagne's, that will stretch across Europe. But what about colonial warfare? Colonies have become very, very important in France's economy. I mean, if you look at the cities where there was growth, where there was wealth in the 18th century, it tends very much to be places like Marseille and Nantes and Bordeaux, which are the great colonial ports, whereby France imported colonial goods and then re-exported them on to other parts of Europe. The entrepôt trade was immensely profitable. Bordeaux, incidentally, the wealth between 1770 and 1790 was increasing faster than the wealth of Paris at that time. It is very important, relatively, to France. And important to some extent, failed, it seems to me, to prioritize colonial policy. He was willing to lose colonies overseas if it would win him concessions in Europe. And the loss of Saint-Domingue was bizarre. On one hand, Toussaint Louverture, the black Haitian general, was a great admirer of Napoleon. He was quite willing at one stage to be Napoleon's governor in Haiti, as long as Napoleon gave him the powers that he demanded. Shortly after that, the French decided to invade Haiti. Napoleon sent Leclerc and a naval force to the island, 6,000 men, to take on the Haitians, to put down the revolt, and, heaven help us, to restore slavery. And he made it clear that he wanted to restore Haiti to the Saint-Domingue of old. That it would be a plantation economy, it would be run by slaves, and the slave trade would be resumed in France. You can imagine the effect this had on Haiti. Toussaint, surprisingly perhaps, beat the French in battle, but more significantly, he simply took to the hills and waited, knowing very well that white Europeans on the whole go down to yellow fever at a certain time of the year, and if you held the French long enough, they probably would all die off without fighting, which is more or less what happened. The Leclerc's expedition in part of disaster, but it was Napoleon's very confused thinking on this that was responsible. He wanted to reimpose slavery one moment, he sold off Louisiana to the Americans the next, almost as he was turning his back on the Caribbean. They still had Guadeloupe, they still had Martinique, but I should say that Saint-Domingue, by the standards of any colony, was the most important, the most productive in 18th century Europe. Much more productive than Barbados or Jamaica or any of Britain's colonies of that time. Expansion in Europe, and I simply state the obvious, we've seen it on the map really, it could take two forms. It could involve the annexation of territories to become part of a greater France, and as we saw by 1812, quite a large part of northern Italy and the Netherlands, what is now Belgium and so on, had been integrated in that way. By 1810, Holland had also been integrated. I'll come back to Holland in just a moment. So that by 1810, France, which was divided into départements, 83 departments in 1790, now boasts 130 departments. Yes, there were two extra ones in France itself, the Garonne and the Loire, but essentially the extra ones were all on foreign annexed territory. And these places were governed in exactly the same way as in France, and the relationship to Paris was exactly the same as any part of continental France would have been. And secondly, you would annex kingdoms to the empire. The distinction is a real one. A king is not the equal of an emperor. A king rules a kingdom, but he rules it in accordance with the rules of the empire. And many of the kings who accept this particular deal, in small German states, for instance, many of them were flattered by Napoleon. No, they had been dukes before, or they had been electors, and he suddenly gave them the title of king, and patted them nicely on the head and told them what to do, as far as I can see. But if they didn't do what he wanted them to do, then that deal could be ripped up at a moment's notice. Hence Holland. Holland, I think, had every reason actually to feel rather insulted by Napoleon. I mean, this was an old-established mercantile economy. It had its own institutions, it had its own church. It ran very well. It was a modern state. When Napoleon took over, he imposed the French model, as he would do. He made it into a kingdom. William Orange was not a king. He made it into a kingdom. He gave his brother the kingdom of Louis, the kingdom of Holland. And then 4 years later, when Louis was a little bit too nice to the Dutch and rather agreed with them when it came to negotiations with France, Louis was sacked and Holland was simply arbitrarily taken into the French Empire and ruled directly from Paris. You see what I mean about kings having a rather uncertain status, when even your brother can be disposed of at will. What Louis had noticed, of course, was that Holland, particularly Amsterdam and Rotterdam, were advanced commercial economies. They were being told by Napoleon to impose a continental blockade, a continental system against Britain. But their entire economy, to some extent, depended on trade in the Baltic and in the North Sea. Exchanges with Britain were very important to the Dutch. So the French were actually asking the Dutch to sacrifice their economy, their mercantile economy, in order to appease Napoleon and that is what led to the breakdown of the Kingdom of Holland and the integration of Holland into France. Now, I don't want to suggest for the moment that there are no benefits in being in the French Empire. There are. Particularly if you are in a part of Europe where you have no access to justice, where the feudal system still applied, for instance, where there was serfdom. There are all sorts of parts of Europe where the individual had very few rights in the 18th century, and the Napoleonic Empire obviously represented a great improvement on the status quo. Essentially, what France promises is stable administration, that is to say, a local authority, a mayor, someone to whom you can turn if you have an administrative grievance. There will be a line of communication, which could bring benefits to local people. He promised justice, and as I say, there are many countries in Europe where there was none. If your seigneur didn't like what you were doing, he simply killed you. That obviously gives way to a very French system, where there were criminal courts and there were correctional courts for minor misdemeanors. The law, in other words, is brought into towns and villages across Europe. But even that has a downside. You may think that being in a legal state where you essentially are protected by the laws is a very good thing, but there was the other side of it, that you must have a force of some sort to enforce the law. So the introduction of the law into society can also mean, and does mean with the French, the introduction of a much stronger police force, the gendarmerie, a gendarmerie which has instructions to enforce the law. Now, in many villages, I would suggest to you, the law has for generations not been enforced. Take smuggling, for instance, along borders, or poaching. These are not things that the state in the 18th century generally was very powerful in suppressing. Napoleon's police were, or were given instructions to do so. And indeed, destroying goods that were breaking the blockade and things of that kind caused deep offence and deep economic hurt to local communities. And finally, of course, we have political opposition. And I say, this is all very nice. Justice, administration, these things will be supplied, and there will be a police there to look after you and protect you. But don't for a moment rise in revolt against the Napoleonic system, because if that happens, the gendarmerie will turn their guns on the community and will bring the army in for help. And this happens inside France as well as in countries that they occupy. In Caen, in Normandy, for instance, in 1812, when there's a big riot about conscription, 12 people are killed in the repression that follows. Occupation also has a cost. Military occupation and military exploitation can come very close one to the other. I mean, as under the Directory, Napoleon's wars were partly about resources. He invaded countries because he could then use their resources to help France and to help France's war effort. By resources, I mean money, I mean taxes, one-off impositions and patriotic loans. All these things are imposed on the countries that France occupies between 1795 and 1807. The billeting of troops. There were no barracks for these enormous armies at this time. They're dependent on local homes to receive soldiers, to pick them up, to feed them at their own expense. And the countries that France occupied were expected to do that when the army was passing by. Above all, conscription. And do bear in mind, conscription, although in one form or another there had been forced service in Europe before the French Revolution, conscription was something new to most societies across Europe. They were not accustomed to it. They were not accustomed to being told that everybody from age 20 to 24 had to be equally available to the recruiting sergeant. This was a novelty, and it usually was a rather unpopular novelty as far as people were concerned. I think armies which could find the men they wanted without conscription tended to do so, believing that volunteers made better professional soldiers and the desertion rates would be lower. The French army then, and indeed always since, has automatically assumed that it would be recruited on the basis of conscription. By 1812, and one effect of this is that only about half of Napoleon's army was still French. But the other countries that had been occupied were all being forced to give men for the French army, but there were legions, some getting very voluntary. I mean, people who loved Napoleon, Poland particularly, provides troops without question. But other countries, most of the German states, most of the Italian principalities and states, most of them had to use conscription in order to fill their allocated number of places. And this causes, of course, deep anger and sometimes revolts, armed risings by the young against the French authorities. More taxes are brought in because the war has to be paid for, and thankfully France can't afford to pay for it by itself. You even get the suspicion after a certain time that countries are being occupied in order to get the resources, in order to finance the war, because without it, the war would have been unsustainable. And the other thing that you have to say, basically, is that the French live off the land. I mean, many armies do when they're crisscrossing Europe. Logistics, in the sense of supply chains and so on, are not the most sophisticated things in the 18th century world. And in some parts of Europe, France had no direct access to its troops. I mean, when they're in, shall we say, East Prussia, or when they're in the Spanish Peninsula, they're quite a long way from France. There are mountain ranges in between. Actually getting food and getting munitions and getting ammunition through to them was a difficult problem. One of the advantages, by the way, that Britain had in the war was that Portugal was an ally, and you could always bring stuff by sea into Lisbon. The French couldn't. So the French lived off the land, which is a polite way of saying they requisitioned and in many cases stole what they needed in order to feed the army. Food for themselves, fodder for their horses. The number of military horses that are killed in these wars is very high. France doesn't really have the resources to replace them all with French horses, so picking some up in northern Germany, for instance, is always a useful strategy. Livestock, meat, cows, sheep. If your army is on the march and is hungry, either the soldiers will steal livestock from fields, or the army will requisition them. And the army preferred, on the whole, to do the second, rather than have a huge discipline problem over its troops. So the number of animals that are requisitioned and yet paid for by the French army as they march is very high. One reason why they had nothing to eat on the way back from Russia, there were many reasons, but one reason was that they had eaten it all on the way out. And if you look at some parts of northern Germany, 90% of the cattle had been driven off and had been slaughtered and eaten by the French army on its way east during the Moscow campaign. So armies living off the land caused real hardship for the local populations that they leave behind. Cultural exploitation, well, if you go to the Louvre in Paris, it is a magnificent art gallery, and it contains good examples of the culture of virtually every European country, bar none. And a lot of stuff from Egypt as well, and the Middle East. And a lot of it arrived there under Napoleon. I mean, the museum that we now know as the Louvre had been established by the French Revolution in 1795. It was a new museum at the time. It was known as the Musée Napoleon, as you might imagine, during the First Empire. And Napoleon very generously gave to it works of art which he looted from across Europe. German historian called Benedict Savoy, she has filled 2 volumes with the works of art that were looted in Germany alone, Italy as well, favourite spots. So the Louvre is full of basically war booty from the Napoleonic Wars. And seized as trophies that are then displayed as signs of the cultural greatness of the French Empire. There's also, as we know in the Egyptian campaign, a genuine cultural curiosity. This is an age of Orientalism, it's an age of where the West is more and more interested in other civilizations and other cultures. So to some degree also, the collection of Egyptian and other Oriental art is much prized at the time. But of course, in the countries which are culturally assaulted in this way, there is a great deal of backlash, and among other things, the growth of a degree of nationalism in consequence. Economic warfare. I've touched on this, I won't say much more, but against Britain in particular, Napoleon concentrates on what he sees as another weapon of war. The British are a commercial nation, a nation of shopkeepers, as he famously called us. Therefore, if you undermine their economy, you would undermine their morale. They also had what Napoleon quite clearly didn't, a parliament that represented the interests of the population. And interests tend to mean, of course, interest groups. So merchants and importers and farmers and others were well represented in parliament. If, Napoleon argued, we undermined the economy, if these people lost money instead of making it, they would turn against the war, they would put pressure on the government to make peace, and in this way, Napoleon could defeat Britain even if he couldn't invade it by sea. It didn't work, but it led to the Berlin Decrees, it led to the continental system from 1806 onwards, and that, I would argue, to some extent, did so much damage to other European states at this time that it was one of the key factors in turning them against Napoleon as soon as they possibly could. And I think actually it is also a major factor in explaining the refusal of Alexander I to compromise with Napoleon. Russia, and particularly in the Baltic, Russia needs foreign trade, and it needs foreign trade with Baltic countries and with Britain. And if Napoleon tries to destroy Russian trade, then he would also, of course, undermine Russia's money for investing in the army. Therefore, it would weaken Russia in relative terms. And right, he can't put up with this. And it is one of the reasons, I think, why, after Tilsit, Alexander pretends to agree to Napoleon's terms, but fundamentally is already rearming and planning for a war which he sees as inevitable. There are other victims of war, of course, apart from soldiers, and it is very obvious in Napoleonic wars, what David Bell has called the first total war, slightly controversially, nonetheless involves civilians. Civilians are deliberately targeted, particularly if they're merchants and merchant marine, who are bringing goods to the enemy. There is huge physical destruction in cities that are caught in the middle of the war. Hamburg is one in North Germany. Leipzig, in the Battle of the Nations in 1813, was fought in the suburbs of a great European city, and the disease that follows from the soldiery as well kills something like 60,000 or 70,000 people in Leipzig alone. Moscow, I'm not quite sure whether you would call Moscow a victim of Napoleon's war or not. I mean, indirectly it certainly is, even if it was the Russians burning their own city to keep Napoleon out. Something incidentally that the Portuguese did as well, but in the countryside. The Portuguese ordered their farmers to destroy their crops, so that when the French attacked towards the coast across from Spain, they would have nothing to eat. It also ordered the farmers to get behind the lines of Torres Vedras, to leave their farms, to leave their property, and to come to the coast and to the cities. So there were civilian victims of all sorts in war, and the Napoleonic War should not be seen simply, I think, as a conflict between armies. Napoleon not alone, by the way, in causing damage. Britain itself was, to some extent, pretty unscrupulous in bombarding Copenhagen in order to stop the Danish navy from falling into Napoleon's hands. You can see why we did it, but there were very large numbers of civilian casualties in that as well. And of course, if you undermine civilians sufficiently, you will create resistance. And I think one of the things about these wars is that partly because they lasted so long, I mean, a generation, if you include the French Revolutionary Wars for 1792, are involved in them, then you get a very large amount of resistance, a large number of violent insurrections against the regimes. There's resistance of different sorts. There's resistance in simply refusing to pay taxes, in slipping off into the woods, if you are threatened with conscription, smuggling goods across frontiers when it's illegal to do so. I mean, all these things are, in a way, forms of resistance to the government and its demands. More significantly, perhaps, there's armed resistance to the military in many of the occupied territories. And in occupied territories which are mountainous, so much depends on the terrain, really. Guerrilla warfare. The word comes from the Spanish resistance to Napoleon, but there's nothing new about it. It's been going on in the valleys of northern Italy and the Tyrol and other places for generations and indeed centuries. But if you have a fixed army, an army like the French, marching through enemy country, in, for instance, Spain, and on rocks and hills and mountains nearby, the easiest way to defend yourself against them is sometimes simply to pick them off as armed guerrillas and then slip gently back into your villages again in the hope that you will remain undetected. The French hated it, as you can imagine, although in 1814, when France was invaded, Napoleon himself encouraged peasants in eastern France to get their shotguns out of the attic and to defend themselves and their farms against those invading their territory. One last thing. Desertion, I think, is another form of resistance, which can be political or can be just a matter of survival. Desertion technically means that a soldier is already in the army and then leaves without permission. I wouldn't make much distinction here between desertion and what the French call insurrection, or draft dodging. It depends very much on place and time and what it is safer to do. If it is safe simply not to turn up for conscription and to hide and be fed by your family or by fellow villagers, then you'll do that. And there are departments of France, to say nothing of the occupied territories, where the rate of insurrection in parts of the period hit 60 or 70%, with a very large-scale refusal to serve. It doesn't correspond particularly to political lines. It's not the case, for instance, that in areas that are deeply Catholic or in areas that are close to the Vendée, the level is much higher than elsewhere. It seems to relate much more to the geography of the area. Is it possible to hide? Is it possible not to serve? And if it is, people will. If, on the other hand, it's difficult, you know what I mean, the gendarmerie come along and arrest your parents, they billet soldiers on you and charge money until such time as you give up your son. But still, you divide the village by picking on the richest inhabitants and billeting soldiers on them until they give up your son. Or you take hostages. I mean, there are various routes to putting pressure on local opinion, to dividing villages against themselves. If that happens, more boys will serve. But then, the desertion rate, once they're in the army, tends to go up accordingly. It's easier that way. I won't spend too long on images. Goya made the Spanish Revolutionary War famous. He also created legends, I have to say, about nationalist fighters. These people probably weren't nationalists at all, but they were fighters, and they were fighting to protect their land or their territory, or their band of brigands, for that matter, against the French and the police. But the retribution that the French enforced, the killing of hostages here, for instance, after the rising on the 2nd of May, the 2 of May in Madrid, became legendary and left its mark, of course, on future nationalist leaders in Spain. I think at the end of his life, Napoleon was failing. I think he was failing in health terms, by the way, as well. He didn't have the strength he had earlier on. But if you look at the last campaigns, what can we say? I mean, they all failed, in a way. In many of them, it seems to me they failed because they gave the people nothing. If you had administration and justice and strong policing, you were at least providing a framework that people might welcome and the elites might join. If, on the other hand, you didn't, if you simply invaded them and had a military presence, and even in Spain that is very largely true, then you're offering the people no reason to support you, no reason to show loyalty towards you. And it seems to me that in Spain in particular, the army remained living off the land, but there were very few benefits for the population. I'll leave you with an open question about Russia. What was he trying to do? I mean, in the earlier parts of the empire, he invaded land in order to integrate them into the empire, to make them part of a pan-European project. He was a realist. He wasn't crazy. There was no way he could possibly have integrated Russia into his pan-European empire. It makes no sense. So did he come all the way to Russia merely to show Alexander I who was master? Merely to prove to the Russians that they could not defy him on the continental system? Or was it just one inglorious error from beginning to end? And the other question I just asked you to think about, did the empire actually need war? We would be talking about war as being a separate policy from empire building. But actually, as one campaigning year gives way to another, it's difficult not to ask the question, does the economy, does the whole basis for a war economy not depend upon always having more conscripts, more taxes, more victories perhaps in order to convince people to join you? Had we got to a stage, in other words, by 1810 or 1811, where there was no particular logic in continuing the war, where making peace on good terms might have been the most attractive alternative, but somehow Napoleon seemed driven to continue his war policy, to start yet another conscription, draining France of manpower. And the supplementary question there at the end, I mean, is this because he was wrong, or is it because perhaps his powers were beginning to fail him, his ability to command the other marshals were less than they had been, the quality of his marshals towards the end of the wars was less good than it had been back in 1806, 1807. All sorts of things were beginning to go wrong, which explained collectively the failure of the last few years, and ultimately, I have to say, the failure of the Napoleonic Wars from the point of view of France and its emperor. So there, I finish.
Charming portrait. Okay, thank you very much for interesting lecture. And I have one question. Many thinkers at different times compare Napoleon with the great people of the past, like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and I want to understand about competence to compare Napoleon with other great people. What's competence about?
Okay, thank you very much. I should say to an extent that probably the first person to compare Napoleon with certainly Alexander the Great and Charlemagne was Napoleon. I mean, he himself talks in these terms. If you look at some of his early newspapers, there's one from the Army Missionary, This is still part, he's a general in the revolutionary armies, in which he has along the top of the paper, almost as a strapline, while Hannibal slept in the Alps, Napoleon was awake in Italy. The comparison between himself and Charlemagne on the one hand, himself as Alexander the Great, even himself and Hannibal, although he never actually had elephants himself in his army, it always had the same purpose, it seemed to me, to draw people's attention to the fact that he belonged to this family of great generals who were particularly, I suppose in France in the 18th century, unlike Britain, for instance, the love of the classics is still very strong. These classical figures still make a deep impression in a way that, say, biblical figures and Christianity did not. So he is putting himself in a tradition of great military men who also enjoy and exercise power judiciously. I think to a degree he does most of that, yes. In the sense that at his peak, in his prime, he was a superb general. He exaggerated, undoubtedly, his own qualities at times. Marengo, for instance, in 1800, one of the battles that he builds into the legend of his rise to power, Marengo was a pretty dodgy affair. I mean, yes, the other side did withdraw, but it could have gone either way. I mean, he does exaggerate. But Ulm, Austerlitz, Jena, Dachau, and a few others, there's clear evidence there of his ability. I think that the other thing about him is he's a political leader, which Alexander the Great was as well. He doesn't often compare himself to Julius Caesar. And I think the reason for that, possibly, is that he had come out of the French Revolution, and Julius Caesar has a very bad reputation. The French revolutionaries are afraid, as any revolutionaries would be afraid, of defeat. They don't know that their revolution is going to succeed. And what they were afraid of back in 1791, 2, 3, is the army. They're afraid of military generals seizing power. And they call this Caesarism because of Julius Caesar, somebody who came from the ranks of the army and became emperor. They didn't know, of course, that Napoleon was going to do exactly that. But to compare yourself with Caesar would have been dangerous because it was a slightly derogatory reference in France in the 1790s. But Alexander the Great, Charlemagne, of course. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you for the lecture. I have a question about the continental system. If it was legal to isolate Britain.
It was realistic to isolate Britain.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a very good question, and it didn't work. So to that extent, looking at it from all the advantage of hindsight, it may have seemed stupidly overambitious. I suppose, looking at it from a French standpoint, what's the threat that Britain presents? I mean, one, it is allied to some of your enemies on the continent. Britain on the whole does not provide many troops. It provides a lot of money. Napoleon is right about that. Even after the 100 days, the campaign that led to Waterloo, there were 4 armies involved: Russia, Austria, and Britain. 3 of these provided 150,000 men each. Britain provided a few men and a lot of money. And this has been Britain's traditional response. It is a commercial powerhouse, and it funds things rather perhaps than fights on land. Its peacetime army is quite small. On the other hand, it has the navy, and it invests heavily in that. I think it's unrealistic in believing that he could invade Britain by sea, which implies having at least temporarily a naval superiority. I think that was unrealistic. On the other hand, the French revolutionaries had come fairly close to using Ireland as a bridging point for invading England. And you could say that the Navy, which France sent to Ireland in 1798, had only failed because it was unlucky, as to say, storms arose and scattered the ships. So it's not perhaps a totally, utterly unreasonable ambition, but given the relative strength of the navies in 1801 or 1804, I think it was fairly unrealistic. Was it realistic then to say, well, if we can't invade Britain, we could shatter her economy? Well, again, it didn't work, but it didn't work partly because he couldn't persuade his allies, he couldn't bully his allies into carrying out the policy. Incidentally, the French themselves continued trading a little bit with Britain for things they needed. It wasn't a total exclusion by any means, even at the top. But using economics as a weapon of war is fairly novel. I suppose the two countries you might use it against would be the commercial countries of Holland and Britain. I don't think it was realistic. I think he was taking on too much. And if indeed it is the case that it was his insistence on the Constantinople blockade that led him to invade Russia, then of course the scale of his insanity becomes clear. I mean, you can't do everything at once and take out every country. You haven't the resources to do so. So my feeling is that he made two big errors. One was believing that he could bring Britain down by economic means alone. And secondly, he invaded Russia.
Thank you for answer on my first question, and I have a second question. How progressive was the recruitment system in the France?
So how successful recruitment system?
Yes.
Well, I can tell you how it was supposed to work. You had 5 classes of conscripts. Essentially, every boy aged between 20 and 24, inclusive, was liable for conscription. Until you were 20, you didn't have to come forward, and once you were 25, you escaped from the recruitment system, in principle anyway. So it is an annual conscription. I mean, unlike in the Revolution, for instance, had introduced a levy en masse in which they drew ballots, but it was everybody between 18 and 45 was liable for that. This is the first time we've tried an annual conscription by age, with the youngest going first. It depends where you are in France. In some areas which have a strong military tradition, say the east of France, they don't seem to have too much difficulty. Armies have always recruited there, and people are accustomed to serving in the army. So if you take departments like Reserve or even the Nord, around about Lille, they don't have too great difficulty. It's when you get into the mountains and into the south that you hit problems. I don't think, as I say, it's because these areas are politically more opposed to Napoleon. I think it's because there's less tradition of military service, and people don't see any reason why they should leave their homes. There may be another slight problem. They do better in cities than they do in the countryside. And it may simply be that in the 18th century it was easier for an artisan or worker to leave his job, spend some time in the army, and come back and resume as a house painter or a roofer or whatever it was, than it is for a peasant. Because peasants very often have to start their career by working on marginal land outside the village, and only once they got married was it likely they get a cottage and a bit of land of their own. So in some parts of France, if you were a peasant, a young peasant, and you went off to the army, what it actually meant was that you probably gave up your chance of independence later in life. That may be another reason why, in some parts of the country, peasants are particularly reluctant to serve. Does it work? Well, yes, in the sense that the French armies are filled, It causes a great deal of alienation of local people in many parts of the country. They have, by 1867, not just the gendarmerie, but they have what sort of flying squads of soldiers going into reluctant villages to encourage people to give up their sons for war. These soldiers, of course, by definition, are people who have been conscripted, and who may resent bitterly the fact that other people are avoiding conscription. So there's no love lost between the two sides. By 1813, 1814, two things are happening. In some parts of France, the desertion rate is going down because people have simply become so accustomed to the annual levies that they accept it. But they are taking people younger and younger. So in the conscription of 1813, you've got boys of 16 being conscripted, which would indicate there simply aren't enough young men for military service. And in some cases, there are open revolts. In Douai, up near Lille in the north, the sub-prefecture is attacked and set on fire by an angry armed crowd and so on. It can cause civil unrest in France as well. But yes, he gets off with it, and they find enough men, until I think the Waterloo campaign. The Waterloo campaign, he had almost as many men as the Allies. Sorry, as Wellington's army against him. But when Blücher joined with his Prussians, and then it became an Anglo-Dutch plus Prussian army, the French were completely outnumbered. And there was nowhere else they could turn. They'd already conscripted all the people they could find for that campaign. And had he won, by the way, the Russians and the Austrians were lying in wait slightly to the east. I mean, there was no chance that that campaign would have been won by Napoleon, with or without victory at Waterloo. So it seems to me that by then, France was exhausted and the system had burned itself out. And of course, by then, the countries that France had previously occupied are no longer providing soldiers. So it has been reduced once again to its own resources.
Maybe one more question, because I think we should make a break and to organize a little rest for our professor. But after the second part, we obviously will discuss every question. One more, please.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to ask you about the relationship between France and Prussia. Considering Napoleon's invasive way to do politics, especially when we speak about the sort of coalitions, is it true to say that if Prussia had entered into a contact with France before Austerlitz battle, France would treat Prussia less as to vassal and actually on an equal footing? Thank you.
Thank you. I followed most of that. There are three countries, it seems to me, which remain at war consistently throughout the entire period, and all the others come and go fairly opportunistically. Austria is one that is involved pretty well all the time. Britain's another, and France, obviously, is the third. Prussia is not consistently at war with France, you're quite right. It joins various coalitions at various times, but at other times seems either neutral or willing to cooperate. And I suppose when you look back over the 18th century, that's always been the case. Alliances for the 7 Years' War, for instance, tend to reverse the alliances of the conflict 10 years earlier. So France and Austria are on one side and Britain and Prussia are on the other. So these tend to be seen, I think, by the rulers as arrangements between rulers who calculate their own self-interest. What changes, it seems to me, utterly is when France, in a Prussian eyes, does something which is awful and unforgivable, which is to destroy Prussia by cutting up their territory. Prussia, a bit like Russia, thought it had a perfect right to a bit of Poland. It had been partitioned in the 1790s. It was very happy with that arrangement. The Poles weren't very happy, but the Prussians were. By throwing his weight on the side of Poland, Napoleon also antagonized the great powers round about. So I think there are different phases of the war, and which Prussia has a real interest in opposing France, and other phases where, well, maybe quite cynically, leaving the fighting to other people, or feeling that its interests are best served by an alliance with Napoleon. I don't know to what extent Alexander I ever thought that an alliance with Napoleon was going to work, but he signed that treaty in 1807. It was in Russia's short-term interest, certainly. Whether it was in its longer interest, I don't know. So I think in a way Prussia's a strange country. It's a country without colonies. So it doesn't have, foreign colonies. So it doesn't have any particular interest in the war fought on the colonial sphere between France and Britain. Holland has an interest in that. It comes into a war in that field. Prussia's interest is entirely on the continent of Europe and within Germany. And I suspect the things that Prussia really doesn't like are, for instance, the alliance of Napoleon and the King of Saxony and things of that kind, which do put pressure within Germany on Prussia's borders. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I suspect that up to a certain point, Prussia thought it was a military power that could cope with Napoleon. Then Jena destroys that illusion, and they are rebuilding desperately in the period from 1807 to 1813 or thereabouts in order to salvage their honour, but also to restore their supremacy over northern Germany, when other people round about, Saxony and so on, have been challenged.